Margaret Whitfield had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her life being defined by the slow shuffle of feet across cracked pavement, the metallic clink of coins dropped into her palm, the flutter of paper tickets in the breeze, and the steady companionship of her dog Rufus, who, though aged and stiff in his movements, remained the one constant thread tying her days together. And if one were to observe her from a distance, they might dismiss her as ordinary. A woman of 49, with auburn hair now generously streaked with grey and pulled into a practical low ponytail. Hazel eyes softened by years of both sorrow and kindness. A lean but sturdy figure standing 5'6", dressed almost always in her faded denim jacket layered over floral blouses that hinted at a yearning for beauty, dark trousers that never quite matched but always sufficed, and sneakers that had moulded themselves to the shape of her life, as firmly as the sidewalks she stood on each day. Yet to know Margaret was to know resilience, for she had been widowed far too young after her husband, a mechanic with grease-stained hands and a booming laugh, was taken from her in a factory accident, leaving her with grief, a modest insurance payout, and a puppy who would grow into the steadfast golden-brown Labrador mix named Rufus, who in his youth had been rambunctious and full of life, but now, entering his 14th year, bore the grey-whitened muzzle and cloudy eyes of age, moving slower, with a stutter in his gait, yet still carrying an unbroken loyalty that seemed to anchor Margaret to the world when loneliness threatened to erode her spirit. Rufus was large for his breed, his frame once muscular, but now leaner with the passage of years, his fur dulled, but still warm in tone, his personality calm and gentle with bursts of surprising alertness. And it was he who lay patiently at Margaret's feet as she sold lottery tickets from her modest cart on East Monroe Street, a corner that smelled of fried food and gasoline, flanked by a laundromat with a flickering neon sign, and a gas station where cars groaned and hissed, the kind of place where most people passed through without lingering, except for the hopeful dreamers who paused to hand Margaret a few crumpled dollars in exchange for a chance at something better. She greeted each of them by name if she could remember, and she often could, for she prided herself on noticing the details others missed, offering small words of encouragement to those who lost yet again, soothing laughter to those who joked about fate never favoring them. And it was this quiet warmth, this subtle offering of humanity, that made her stand feel less like a transaction and more like a ritual of community, though Margaret herself would never have described it in such grand terms. Her days bled together in the sameness of the routine, yet beneath the surface was the dull ache of solitude, the absence of children she and her late husband had once dreamed of, the silence of nights spent in a small apartment whose walls echoed only with Rufus's steady breathing. And though she did not dwell on regrets, they were there, unspoken companions she carried as surely as she carried her worn canvas bag each day, tucked with sandwiches, a thermos of tea, and biscuits for Rufus. The neighborhood knew her as the lottery woman, and though most glanced only briefly at her, a few saw her more clearly, like the Carter family who lived a few blocks down. David Carter, a man in his mid-30s with a clean-shaven square jaw and a medium build, softened by office work but strengthened by an easy kindness. His wife Eliza, petite with pale skin and shoulder-length brown hair often tied back neatly, her eyes gentle but keen, and their two children, Ben, an energetic boy of 8 with tousled hair and a tendency to chatter about everything, and Lily, a quieter 6-year-old with large brown eyes and a way of clutching toys as though they were lifelines. They would wave to Margaret on their walks, sometimes stop to scratch Rufus behind the ears, the children giggling as his tail thumped happily against the sidewalk, and though Margaret's interactions with them were brief, she cherished them in the way solitary people often cherish even passing kindnesses, the reminder that they are still seen. On one evening, as twilight deepened and the sky shifted into bruised purples and smoky oranges, Margaret lingered later than usual, closing up her cart while Rufus grew oddly restless, sniffing at the air and tugging at the leash with a determination that belied his years, his body vibrating with an alertness Margaret had not witnessed in months. And though she frowned, unsure of what troubled him, she let him lead, trusting the instincts that had once saved her from an oncoming car when he yanked her backward by his leash years ago. They turned down a street Margaret rarely walked, the air thickening with something acrid, a sharp tang that prickled her nose. And then she saw it, the faintest curl of grey smoke rising above the rooftops, followed by the flicker of orange light reflecting in the second-story window of a modest two-story house she recognized immediately as the Carters. Her heart seized, her hands trembling as she tightened her grip on Rufus's leash, her mind whirling with disbelief and dread. And then Rufus barked, a deep, raw sound that startled even Margaret, for it was the bark of urgency, of command, the bark of an old soldier who recognized danger and refused to be ignored. And with that sound, Margaret was propelled forward, her sneakers pounding the pavement, her breath quickening, her hazel eyes fixed on the site of the Carter home, where flames had begun licking at the curtains through the back window and smoke poured heavier into the night. She shouted their names, "David! Eliza! Kids!" Her voice hoarse against the crackle of fire, but the roar of the blaze swallowed her cries, and she saw shadows moving frantically inside, silhouettes trapped behind glass, and a primal terror surged through her veins as realization hit. They were still inside. Neighbors had begun to gather at windows and porches, their faces pale with fear, some clutching phones, others frozen in indecision, none daring to step forward, and Margaret felt a flash of anger at their hesitation. But she did not pause to scold them, for her instincts screamed that every second mattered, that lives were balanced on the edge of seconds, and she ran up the porch steps, Rufus lunging with her, barking furiously now, his white-muzzled face fierce in the glow of the flames. The heat struck her even before she reached the door, the kind of heat that sears the skin and makes the eyes water, and she coughed against the smoke curling outward. But she pressed her hand to the doorknob anyway, flinching at its warmth, and found it unmoving, stuck, as though something held it fast from the outside. And when she yanked harder and heard the metallic rattle of a chain, she knew with chilling certainty that this was no accident, that someone had locked the Carters inside, condemning them to burn. Rage lit through her, mingling with fear, and she shouted again, her voice breaking, "Hold on! I'm here!" Rufus pawed furiously at the door, whining between barks, his aged body quaking with effort, and Margaret spun, scanning for another way in, her mind racing, her lungs screaming for clean air. And even in that chaos, she remembered flashes of the Carters' kindness, the way Lily had once placed a flower in Rufus's collar, the way David had lifted his hand in greeting every morning. And she knew she could not let this family die, not while she still drew breath. That moment, poised between despair and determination, was the true beginning of everything that would follow. The moment when an ordinary lottery vendor, overlooked by most, and her faithful aging dog would step into a storm of fire, suspicion, and danger, their lives forever altered by a choice made not of calculation, but of instinct, a choice to fight against the flames and against whoever had dared to set them. And as the fire roared louder and the night around her filled with the gasps of neighbors too afraid to act, Margaret took a breath, thick with smoke, tightened her grip on Rufus's leash, and prepared to do the unthinkable. Inside the Carter home, the evening had begun with the gentle, unremarkable comfort that always fools people into thinking danger is a stranger to ordinary rooms. Because Eliza Carter, petite at 5'3" with pale skin that flushed easily, brown hair pulled into a practical looped ponytail, soft grey cardigan draped over a navy t-shirt and jeans, had been humming along to a Motown station while she finished a lemon parsley pasta in the small kitchen whose windowsill held 3 stubborn basil plants, and David, mid-30s, clean-shaven, medium build that carried a hint of weekend basketball under button-downs and sight maps, voice even, posture attentive in a way that made co-workers trust him, was helping 8-year-old Ben align the last pieces of their foam and plastic roller coaster kit in the den, its bright loops and stanchions claiming the coffee table like a monument to shared patience, while 6-year-old Lily, with her quick, observant brown eyes and a single thin braid, lay on the rug-colouring clouds that looked like sheep. A box fan purred from the living room window. And the house itself, a modest two-story with a sloped roof and squeaky stairs, seemed to be breathing with them, harmless and companionable, until the first note of wrongness floated in. So faint Eliza almost mistook it for a burnt crumb rattling in the toaster. Something chemical and sweet-edged that did not belong to marinades or cleaners or anything a tidy mother keeps under a sink. And when she paused, wooden spoon hanging mid-air like a conductor's baton, the scent slipped back into the house's corners, as if embarrassed to be caught. And she shook her head, set plates, laughed when the radio DJ botched a dedication. A minute later, a whisper of coolness slid along the baseboards that wasn't quite a draft. A thread-like temperature drop that felt like someone had opened a mouth to the outside and then pressed a finger to their lips. And Lily looked up like a bird tilting to listen and said, "Mom?" with no fear in her voice, only curiosity, which is a sister to warning when you are 6. Eliza wiped her hands, walked down the short hall to the laundry room door. White paint, brass knob warmed by old winters, and touched metal that felt the tiniest bit feverish, the kind of heat you question because you want to be wrong. She opened the door and saw a shadow behind the washer where it never is, a rag or plastic bag fallen into a shape that wasn't tidy, and she thought about bending to pick it up, but the smell rose to meet her then. Not faint now, but unmistakable, the sickly sweet bite of gasoline, childhood memories of her father's garage snapping into place at the back of her nose, and her stomach dropped. At the same time, her body moved backward without asking her permission, because a human body knows certain truths before the mind will consent to say them aloud. And she called for David, calm voice turning iron at the edges. And he came at a half-run with Ben right behind him, Lily at Eliza's hip. And in the instant before the house changed forever, Eliza said, too softly to be the alarm she meant, "Something's in there. It smells like..." And David filled the rest with a word neither of them wanted to hear: gasoline. He touched the washer, the vent hose, the vinyl flooring, verifying reality like an engineer checks stress points, and the laundry room answered them with a small cough of orange behind the machines, a breath taken by something that wants to grow. He slammed the door and jammed the heel of his hand against it, as if that could hold back chemistry and intent, and hissed at Eliza, "Extinguisher," which she had bought after a kitchen safety class and kept under the sink and now shoved into his hands with the logic of people who prepare for unlikely things, hoping to make them impossible. And he popped the pin and sprayed in an arc through a 2-inch gap he forced with his shoulder, and the hiss of angry snow met a pocket of heat that had found a meal. And the physics of it was wrong, all wrong, because fire should cringe under that blast, not swell as if it were being cheered. David's eyes told him what his heart refused to say. This wasn't a lint flare-up. Some fool had fed this room a path. "Upstairs," he said, voice clipped into commands that made the children move. "Shoes on, coats, we go out the front." And as they turned, the house exhaled a different breath, smoke shouldering along the hall baseboards with intent, not wandering, but seeking. And Eliza thought, with a cold flash of certainty, that the fire had been given instructions. They bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, because up felt like a way, the air, though greying now, still breathable. David cracked the master bedroom window to pull in a sleeve of night, shouted for help into the neighborhood like a man punching through a dream. And across the street, Mrs. Greeley's television flashed blue, and near the corner, 2 teenagers stalled, phones in hand, performing courage for one another, but not moving yet. And when smoke pushed harder into the room, David slammed the window down to a narrow smile to keep fresh oxygen from pouring the wrong way, then gathered Ben's gaze with that father look that communicates a whole language. "Listen, do this, be brave." And they went back to the landing with coats half on, and shoes a mess, and Eliza wrapping her cardigan around Lily's nose the way her own mother had once done during a bonfire that got out of hand. The hallway to the front door had become a grey tunnel. The radio in the kitchen below clung to its cheerful chorus for 2 lines too long, defying the new reality until the smoke coughed it silent. And when David reached the door, he turned the knob and it moved and then caught as if pinched. a hitch that sounded like metal on metal, and he put his shoulder to it, and the whole frame answered with the rattle of a chain he did not own, the cheap, hollow laughter of a padlock that had no business there, and the shock of it slammed through him like a punched lung. Someone had done this, and his hands found rage as easily as the doorknob, because fear has a twin called fury that wakes when our people are threatened, and he drove his weight into the panel again to no effect, then dragged the coffee table from the den, smashing it into the bay window until the lower panes surrendered their lives with a clap and a shower of shards into the shrubs, the inhale of outside air sucking the curtains toward the frame in a gorgeous, terrible billow. "Go," he said, and he meant Eliza first, and children after, and himself last, because love is a sequence, not a feeling. And they climbed through with a graceless scramble that scraped knees and dignity, and the alarm in Lily's tiny squeak cut Eliza's heart even as her feet met grass. And David followed them just as something heavy collapsed in the laundry room with a bowling ball thud that vibrated through the floorboards like a warning drum. They sprawled onto the front lawn, the air outside so cold and big it almost hurt to breathe, and a brief, savage relief knifed through the terror, the taste of survival, before instinct broke them into separate magnets for different tasks. Eliza gathered the children and scanned for burns with a medic's focus she'd never trained for. David charged back to the door because firefighters, when they came, would need access. And the logic of action beats the logic of fear. And he fumbled at the chain's interior latch to no purpose because the padlock body hung outside like a sneer. And just then, a car slid to a stop at the curb with a desperate chirp, and a woman with grey-streaked auburn hair and a denim jacket was already out before the engine had decided what to do next. And beside her, an old golden-brown Labrador with a white muzzle hurled himself toward the stoop, with the muscle memory of duty, barking a raw, low siren, and Margaret's hazel eyes took in the scene with triage clarity. Family accounted for, door chained, grey-black smoke switching to brown, which meant something ugly in the fire's diet, and she asked, "Anyone in?" Because you ask even when the answer seems clear, and Eliza shook her head and then stammered, "The chain, someone," and Margaret's mouth set at a warrior slant you do not expect on a lottery vendor as her fingers tested the give of a bracket through hot metal, and Rufus pressed his nose to the seam and poured twice as if counting the seconds they had bartered back from death, and behind them neighbours found their courage, or at least their cameras. But it was the sound of the first siren threading up East Monroe that let the air change flavour, a promise of professionalism cutting through amateur terror. "Side gate?" Margaret said, not a question, and Eliza pointed with a jerk, and Margaret ran the narrow flagstone along hydrangeas that clawed at her. Calves, Rufus pacing her with the determined, stuttery gait of a soldier past his prime who refuses to retire. And at the gate, the latch wore duct tape like a gag. Margaret ripped it free with nails that had opened coin rolls and stuck posters, and once, long ago, bandaged a husband in a parking lot. And they shouldered through into the backyard, where the laundry window now pulsed a bloom of orange too bright to be contained. And on the concrete beneath it, a dark comet tail smear told a story Ray Molina would read later. Shards of a small brown bottle, glittering like uncut doubt in the grass. And Margaret understood two things fast. This way in was suicide, and the kitchen window a few feet to the left had been jimmied up a quarter-inch by someone who didn't know this house's stubborn paint or didn't care. And she slid her jacket sleeve over her hand to lift the latch and worked the sash up 3 inches, 4, inhaling the hot soap metal stink that lives in rooms about to be ruined. And she pictured how air might draft, how flame might lean toward a gift, and stopped, because sometimes the bravest door is the one you don't open. Back at the front, David had jammed a spade under the chain bracket and was trying to pry screws out of their history, breath a hacking metronome, and Margaret's palm closed over his in a grip that steadied without scolding. "Irons are 30 seconds out," she said, and he heard what she didn't add. "We've kept you alive for those 30. And he looked at her, with gratitude knotted to rage and an apology no language can carry. And Rufus's ears flicked toward the hedge where the side fence met the alley. and Margaret followed his stare and saw, for just 2 heartbeats, a still shape tucked in the green. A shoulder set at a tilt that read as evaluation, not fright, and a head angling like a man checking work. And then the shape melted backward into alley dark, and her mind stitched a ribbon through that observation. Hold for later, bright red, and a fire engine shouldered the corner with a bellow of authority that made the teenagers actually move their legs. The first-in crew did what first-in crews do, established a line, masked up, took the front like a castle, and their captain, a tall black woman in her early 40s, tight coils under her helmet, calm carved into her jawline, forearms thick with strength that had been earned alarm by alarm, took a 3-second inventory and cut the chain with a Halligan and bolt cutters as if it had never been there, then vanished inside her own command, while another team flaked hose toward the den's bay where flame licked the curtains with a cat's cruelty. She made the kind of choices people write training manuals about, and while she moved, the white SUV of the fire investigator slid to the curb, and outstepped Ray Molina, late 50s, 5'10", salt and pepper mustache trimmed to executive neatness, eyes sharpened by 3 decades of negotiating with, lies told by wood and fuel, shoulders that had learned to carry fury without spilling it, and he scanned the front in a single long look that said he was reading more than seeing. He asked crisp questions. Who found the chain? You smelled what? Any work done here this week? Access to yard? Any threats recently? And Eliza, who had been a woman who stored everything in lists long before tonight, turned her into a witness, answered with a clarity that surprised her own lungs, saying yes to gasoline, yes to duct tape on the side gate, yes to emails at David's office about a land use fight his company was managing, no to any feuds with neighbours beyond the usual parking complaints, and when she said the words, "They said we were impediments," Ray's gaze flicked past her toward the alley as if he could drag the watcher back by attention alone. The captain called primary clear on the first floor, a sound like a hand unclenching, then a demand to vent near the den while her nozzle team beat down flame that had gotten arrogant, and the house's noises changed register, the crackle turning to hiss as water did what water does best, to lies told by accelerant. On the sidewalk, the neighborhood gathered itself into a new shape. The 2 teenage boys, red-faced and suddenly useful under Margaret's direction, flagged down the second engine with details no adult had time to fetch. Mrs. Greeley pressed a wet dish towel to Lily's mouth and told her in a trembling whisper about the time lightning struck her brother's barn and how everyone had still made it out to eat pound cake in the yard. And Ben, who had been vibrating with a need to rescue something, spotted the neighbour's skeptical Tabby Roxy compressed into a terrified comma under the porch chair. And Margaret, who had once coaxed a stray terrier out from under a city bus, slid to the boards and whispered patience, drawing the cat into her hands without theatrics and depositing her against Ben's chest so the boy could have one victory shaped like a purr, while the rest of the night rearranged what he thought houses were for. David stood with his fists at his sides in the posture of men who want to smash and cannot, soot making clean tracks on his cheeks where tears had carved honesty. And when he turned to thank Margaret, the words were ungainly and unnecessary because his face had already said them, and she, who had lived a decade being treated like a landmark rather than a person, met his eyes without flinching, and then looked down at Rufus, whose flanks soared with effort but whose gaze was bright as a lighthouse. And she told him, "Good boy," in a voice that belonged in a chapel. Ray circled to the backyard with a small LED flashlight, pausing at the tape-tacky latch, bagging glass shard constellations from the grass, sniffing the air where the spill pattern darkened concrete, making notes in a pocketbook that had lived 3 sweater pockets and 13 scenes like this one, already this year. And when he came back around the house, the captain met him at the stoop, mask lifted to hang at her collar, face smoke-smudged, eyes alight with the ferocity of people who win fights for a living, and said low, "It's not a dryer fire." And he answered, equally low, "No, it's a message." By the time the main body of fire had been knocked down, steam curled like exhausted ghosts through the blown windows. The roller coaster model in the den lay collapsed in an elegy of bright plastic, and the chain on the front door hung in a clear evidence bag like a bad idea caught in the act. The ambulance medic, a stocky Latino with a gentle baritone and a tattoo of a robin peeking from his sleeve, checked Lily's lungs and wrapped a faint pink stripe on Eliza's forearm, set Ben on oxygen like a superhero tank, and asked David what hurt, and received the honest answer, everything, to which he nodded like a man who had heard that verdict before and knew the prescription would be time, soup, and the unacceptable chore of living in a house you no longer trust. Ray took statements in small bites so as not to drown anyone. And when he asked whether anything unusual had happened this week that felt like a coincidence trying too hard, David said a contractor who'd been passed over for a bid had shouted in a public meeting 2 nights ago, "You can't keep us out forever." And Eliza remembered a white van idling in the alley on Friday with magnet signs taped over a logo as if the vehicle itself were ashamed of its day job, and Margaret added evenly that a man had stood too still by the hedge 10 minutes before the first engine arrived. The kind of still that isn't fear but appraisal. And Ray's pen stopped for a fraction before moving again, which is what pens do when investigators pretend not to react. He asked Margaret to repeat her description, and she did. A medium height, baseball cap pulled low, jacket hanging loose like it didn't belong to him. The particular tilt of the head that said he was not in shock, but in quality control. And Ray let out a breath that sounded like, "Of course." When the last visible flame was out, and the crews moved into overhaul with their gloved hands testing walls for hidden heat, the captain came to the family, and in a voice that had practiced delivering hard truths, kindly said what everyone already knew in their bones, that the initial signs were consistent with an intentionally set fire, that the chained door was an obvious criminal act, that the investigator would coordinate with police, and that tonight they were alive because of fast choices, a window sacrificed at the right moment, and a woman and her old dog who refused to walk past smoke. Eliza reached for Margaret's hand impulsively and found it, strong and calloused, the hand of someone who has stood in weather and counted singles. And she said, "Thank you," so softly it might have been a prayer. And Margaret, who disliked being fussed over, tilted her chin toward Rufus, credit handed downward as if the dog could carry it better than she could. And Rufus wagged once like a slow metronome, marking the end of one movement and the beginning of another. Dawn had not yet hinted at the horizon, but already the Carter's future had been divided into before and after, and in the grey space between those words, Ray stood at the curb and made 3 calls. One to his lab tech about expedited accelerant analysis, one to a detective he trusted more than the others because the man listened before he spoke, and one to a friend in code enforcement who could pull permit disputes and developer rosters without raising flags. Margaret, standing a little apart now that the active crisis had settled, watched the neighborhood drift back towards something like normal. Curtains closing, phones dropping into pockets, adrenaline sagging into shivers, and felt a pivot inside herself, a slow, decisive click like a coin reaching the bottom of a machine. She had been needed, and she had answered, and the night had repaid her with a glimpse of something rotten pretending to be progress. She looked down at Rufus, at the white frosting his years had laid across his muzzle, and scratched the soft fur behind his ear, and said in a low voice meant only for him, "We're not done." And the dog, whose hearing wasn't what it used to be, but whose heart heard everything, leaned his weight against her shin, as if to say he already knew. The house was no longer a home, but a beast alive with smoke and flame, its windows glowing orange as if it had swallowed the sun. The air thick with acrid heat that clawed the throat, and though the firefighters had begun their assault with practiced precision, the moments before their hoses took command of the blaze were the most fragile. The seconds when survival was decided not by equipment, but by instinct and will. And into that chaos stepped Margaret Whitfield, her auburn hair streaked grey shining in the flicker of firelight, denim jacket singed at one cuff, hazel eyes sharp with a clarity born not of training but of necessity, and Rufus, the 14-year-old Labrador mix whose age showed in the stiffness of his gait and the whitening of his muzzle, now moved with a purpose that seemed to peel years from his body, barking low and sharp, pawing at the stoop as if urging Margaret into action. David Carter, soot smearing his clean-shaven face, medium build, heaving with exertion, stood with his fists clenched in helpless fury at being kept outside while his family clung to him. Eliza clutching Lily so tightly the child's thin braid pressed against her cheek, Ben gripping the rescued cat with wide eyes that shone with terror, and in that charged moment the decision crystallized. Margaret and her dog would not simply wait, they would act. She darted toward the side of the house where the gate hung broken from the fire crew's entry. Rufus loping with her, lungs rattling but heart resolute, and together they slipped into the backyard where the flames had not yet claimed everything. The kitchen window, already pried an inch by whoever had set this fire, sagged under the heat. The paint blistered, the glass smeared with soot, and Margaret knew it was the only entry point before the fire spread further. She tugged her sleeve over her hand, jammed the sash higher, and forced her shoulders through, coughing violently as smoke scraped her lungs. But inside, she found a pocket of breathable space near the floor, and Rufus, to her astonishment, scrambled through behind her with a grunt, his claws clicking on the linoleum as he landed beside her, eyes watering but alert. The kitchen was half lit in a hellish glow, the countertops hidden behind a veil of grey, the refrigerator humming absurdly faithful even as the house burned, and the hallway beyond already licked by flame along its baseboards. She called out, her voice breaking, "Is anyone here?" Though she knew the Carters had escaped, yet from upstairs a faint, high wail answered. Someone hadn't made it out. Perhaps a neighbour child visiting, perhaps a mistake in the head count. And Margaret's heart hammered as she realized her night was not finished. Rufus barked, low and insistent, his body pivoting toward the stairs, and Margaret followed, dropping low, crawling with her sleeve pressed over her mouth, every breath a negotiation with the choking air. The stairs groaned under her weight, heat searing through the soles of her sneakers, but she pressed on, Rufus climbing beside her with determination that defied his years, and together they reached the landing where the air was a shade clearer, the fire's focus still downstairs. In the far bedroom, a small figure coughed weakly, a girl, no more than 10, thin frame curled against the bed as though she had tried to hide. Margaret scooped her up, the child's weight light, but searing hot from the room's fever, and shouted reassurance she wasn't sure the girl could hear, then turned back toward the stairs only to find the path had narrowed, the flames climbing faster than she had reckoned, hungry for air. Panic clawed at her edges, but Rufus surged ahead, nosing at a side window in the hall, his paws scratching furiously as though to say, "Here, here." And Margaret staggered toward it, balancing the child against her chest, kicking at the warped frame until the glass shattered outward with a crash. Cool night air poured in, and outside, 2 firefighters saw the break and rushed with a ladder, shouting that they had her, that she only had to hold on. Margaret clutched the girl tighter, lowered her onto the rungs into waiting arms, then reached back for Rufus, who balked at the sill, too wide, too old. But when she grabbed his collar and urged, he shoved his body forward with a grunt of effort, and together they tumbled onto the porch roof and then down the ladder, collapsing into the grass as neighbours screamed with relief. The girl was handed to medics, coughing but alive, her frightened parents arriving moments later to gather her in shaking arms, and David Carter fell to his knees beside Margaret, gripping her soot-streaked hands with a gratitude too fierce for words, while Rufus lay panting, chest heaving, his white-muzzled face turned toward the fire as if daring it to take another. Around them, the firefighters worked with relentless rhythm, water hissing against flame, the captain barking orders sharp and precise. Ray Molina, the investigator, already noting details that smelled of arson rather than accident. But in that moment, Margaret was only aware of the child's fragile breathing, the weight of soot in her own lungs, and the tremor of Rufus's flanks against her leg. She had not sought to be a hero. She had only followed a dog's instinct and her own unwillingness to walk away. But the night had written her into a story larger than she imagined, a story that would not end with fire doused, but with truths dragged into light. For now, she sat in the wet grass, coughing into her sleeve, Rufus's head heavy against her thigh, the Carters safe beside her, and the crowd buzzing with disbelief that the lottery ticket woman and her aging dog had charged into a burning house to pull life from the smoke. The fire hissed, the house groaned, and Margaret, through stinging eyes, knew that the blaze was not an accident, that someone had chained those doors and poured that gasoline, and that survival tonight was only the beginning of a fight she had never asked for, but could no longer refuse. The fire was finally reduced to a smouldering skeleton by the time dawn began to tease pale ribbons of grey across the horizon, steam curling from the blackened frame like ghosts reluctant to leave. But the street was alive with murmurs, flashing lights, and the clatter of equipment as firefighters rolled hoses, checked for hotspots, and made sure the beast they had battled could not rise again. And in the middle of that restless order stood Margaret Whitfield, her denim jacket streaked with soot, her hazel eyes red from smoke but alert. Rufus lying at her feet with his flanks heaving like a bellows, his golden brown fur singed in patches, yet his gaze still watchful as though even in exhaustion he would not stop guarding. She had thought the danger ended when the flames were tamed, but she realized quickly that what lingered was far more insidious, because fire leaves evidence in its wake, whispers in charred timber and melted glass, and those whispers were already telling investigators a story of human malice. Ray Molina, the veteran fire investigator with his salt and pepper mustache trimmed neatly, square shoulders carried with the weary grace of a man who had seen too many tragedies birthed by greed or vengeance, crouched near the remains of the laundry room where the blaze had begun, his gloved fingers delicately collecting fragments of glass, sniffing the air where the odor of accelerant clung stubbornly, his eyes narrowing at the scorch patterns that crawled along the floor in unnatural lines. And when he straightened, he carried not the blank mask of uncertainty, but the grim certainty of recognition, turning toward the captain of the fire crew, a tall black woman with tight coils tucked under her helmet and a no-nonsense expression softened only by the respect she held for the lives her team had saved, and said low enough for only her to hear, "This was set." The captain didn't flinch, only gave a terse nod and ordered her crew to cordon off the area, knowing that Arson transformed the scene from accident to crime, from tragedy to evidence, and that now the family standing huddled on the curb was not just lucky, but targeted. David Carter, soot streaking his clean-shaven jaw, stood stiffly with one arm wrapped protectively around his wife Eliza and their two children pressed close between them, his medium build trembling not from fatigue but from fury barely contained. Because when Ray approached and asked if they had any enemies, any disputes, anything that might have made them a target, David's mind snapped instantly to the emails he had dismissed as empty threats, anonymous tirades that had trickled into his inbox ever since his construction firm had secured the contract to oversee the redevelopment of an old industrial lot on the edge of town. Emails that had called him a parasite, a thief of livelihoods, a pawn of greedy developers, and though he had laughed them off at first, he now heard them again with a new weight. The words, "You can't keep us out forever," echoing like gasoline poured over memory. And his fists clenched so tightly, Eliza had to place her hand over his to remind him their children were watching. Eliza, petite frame wrapped in a soot-stained cardigan, pale face blotched with smoke burns and worry, spoke softly but firmly, telling Ray about the white van she had seen idling in the alley on Friday with taped-over signs. How she had thought it suspicious at the time but brushed it away. How she now wished she had written down the license plate. And Ray noted every word, his pen scratching like a blade cutting into truth, his eyes occasionally lifting to Margaret, who stood apart yet near, the witness whose instincts and courage had altered the night's outcome. Margaret had not thought herself part of this story beyond the rescue, but when Ray asked her to describe the figure she had glimpsed by the hedge, a medium-built man, jacket too loose, baseball cap pulled low, posture too calm for panic, she realized her life had shifted. She was no longer invisible, the ticket seller on the corner. She was a thread in a tapestry of crime that would now be unraveled, and the thought made her uneasy in a way the fire itself had not. Neighbours gathered in loose clusters, gossip mixing with relief, their voices a blend of awe and suspicion. Some praising Margaret and Rufus as heroes, others whispering theories about why the Carters had been targeted, but all agreeing that this fire was no accident. And the knowledge spread like its own flame, igniting fear in a community that had always thought itself safe from deliberate malice. Rufus, sensing the tension, growled low when a stranger drifted too close, his old body taut with protective instinct. And Margaret soothed him with a scratch behind the ears, murmuring that he had done enough for one night, though in truth she felt the same unease coiling in her stomach, the certainty that whoever had set this fire was not done. Ray gathered the Carters' statements, promised police would follow up, and offered them temporary housing assistance. But the words felt like patches over a fracture too deep, because the Carters knew they could never sleep in that house again. Its walls blackened, its windows gaping like sockets of a skull, its memories forever contaminated by smoke and chains and fear. As dawn broke fully, firefighters packed up, neighbours drifted away, and only the Carters, Margaret, Rufus, and Ray remained with the wreckage, the silence between sirens heavy with questions unasked. Margaret finally crouched beside Rufus, her denim jacket brushing his singed fur, and whispered to him, as though he were the only one who could hear the truth in her heart, that they had done something extraordinary tonight. But extraordinary things draw eyes, and she feared they had now stepped into a storm not of their making. When she rose, Ray was watching her with the kind of look that measured people not by their past, but by their potential in what was coming. And though he said nothing more, she understood he already saw her as part of this investigation, whether she wished to be or not. And so, the whispers of arson lingered in the smoke, curling invisible fingers around the Carters' lives, around Margaret's quiet existence, around Rufus's weary frame, promising that the fire had been only the beginning, that behind its flames waited men with motives, shadows with teeth, and that the ordinary corner vendor and her aging dog had been drafted into a conflict that would demand more of them than they had ever thought they could give. The morning after the fire did not arrive as a clean slate, but as a paler shade of night, a grey that seeped into everything and made even coffee taste like smoke. And though the Carters had been moved to a modest, city-arranged motel room, with 2 queen beds that squeaked when you breathed, and a view of a parking lot littered with soda cups, the sense of siege travelled with them, because danger is not a house fire you can hose down. It is a will, and wills learn to follow. David paced with a restless precision that distressed the cheap carpet, his clean-shaven jaw shadowed by a night that had not allowed a razor, his medium frame tight as wire, while Eliza, small and pale, tried to weave a fragile normal from thin materials, extra toothbrushes from the front desk, a knock-off cereal cup for Ben, colouring pencils for Lily, her cardigan wrapped around shoulders that hadn't stopped flinching. The children, exhausted and quick to adapt the way children are, clung to tasks. Ben fed the sceptical Tabby Roxy with reverence. Lily traced circles on motel stationery. Yet both jumped at every hallway voice. And in the chair by the window sat Margaret Whitfield, with Rufus's blocky head across her shin like a sandbag. The old dog asleep, but vigilant in the odd way dogs can be. And Margaret's hazel eyes, reddened at the rims, scanning the parking lot for patterns that didn't belong. A van that lingered without cause. A man who watched without watching. A repetition of faces that meant someone was not incidental. Ray Molina had insisted on this place, the chain motel with exterior corridors and cameras that actually worked, and posted a patrol unit to swing through every hour with lights off, and before leaving, he had put a hand on the cheap dresser and delivered instructions with the kind of quiet gravity that brooks no debate. Do not answer the door for anyone but me or Officer Trin, a Vietnamese-American patrol woman in her late 20s with a neat black bob, clear, assessing eyes, and a manner that mixed courtesy with steel. Keep the curtains cracked 2 inches only. If the phone rings and the caller asks for anything but your pizza order, hang up and call me. And when Eliza forced out the inevitable question, why would they come back if we got away? Ray had not lied, which is its own mercy, and said that people who start fires for money or power tend to be perfectionists about results. Margaret had heard the tone, had memorized it the way she memorized combinations of numbers customers loved to play, and now, in the thin morning, with the motel AC rattling and the smell of overly sweet air freshener trying and failing to smother the scent of worry, she felt the next movement of this new life click into place. Waiting would not be neutral. Waiting would be an invitation. She rose, careful not to jostle Rufus, and told Eliza in a voice that aimed at ordinary that she would grab tea from the lobby and take Rufus for a lap. And though Eliza's mouth opened with protest, the older woman's calm didn't leave room for it, and so Margaret left with the leash looped over her wrist and Rufus's gait stuttering into motion, a veteran resuming duty. Outside, the parking lot wore last night's evidence in small ways. A smear of ash on the Camry roofline, two neighbours by the soda machine whispering "Arson" like a curse. And Margaret walked the perimeter with Rufus in a slow, deliberate loop, making herself both a watcher and something to be watched, because sometimes you learn the shape of a threat by letting it draw the outline of you. By the dumpster, a man in a high-vis hoodie lowered his phone a fraction too slowly, eyes flicking to Rufus, then to her, then away with a practiced blankness, and Margaret filed him with all the other maybes, a cabinet her memory had learned to keep tidy, and returned to the room with tea and muffins too sweet to be breakfast, but good enough to be a bridge. 10 minutes later, a knock came not at their door, but at the next, a rapid 3-beat that sounded like confidence, and Margaret felt the hairs along her arms lift, because confidence is a mask, and masks are for performances, and she set the tea down and stepped to the curtain slit, meeting the eyes of Officer Trin in the reflection of the window glass. The officer's jaw moved once, stay, and then she drifted out of sight like a ghost, and from the next room a man's voice sounded in a tone too friendly for morning. "Maintenance, ma'am, water check." And Margaret exhaled the breath she hadn't known she was holding, seeing the test for what it was. And after a beat, the knock moved on. The voice tried again at 2 more doors, and a minute later, Ray rounded the corner with a badge on a lanyard and a column of unamused silence radiating from him, and the high-vis man by the dumpster flicked his phone away with guilty speed. Officer Trin appeared as if conjured, asked for ID, and found only a contractor's business card with a half-peeled magnet-back logo and a number that went nowhere. And Ray, who hated coincidences almost as much as he hated sloppy criminals, took the card in 2 fingers as if it were a wasp and said mildly, "You forgot the part where you have a work order." And the man muttered a curse and left too fast for innocence. The pressure did not lift, it redistributed. By noon, Ray had a sketch of 3 concentric circles of suspects. On the inner ring, the out-of-town LLC backing the development plan that David's firm managed, a shell inside a shell registered to a lawyer who cologned his letters. On the second ring, the bruised contractors who had lost bids, including one small-time demolition guy with a temper, a brother on probation, and a Facebook page that alternated between flag worship and threats at City Hall meetings. And on the widest ring, the NIMBY coalition, a leader with a folksy smile, and a mortgage tied to a cousin's parcel that would increase in value if the redevelopment failed, the loudest protester who had rented a white van for community supply drives, and a handful of anonymous commenters who wrote like men who thought the internet was trench and flare and not a place where punctuation could turn into prison. Ray walked Margaret through none of this in detail because she was a civilian who had already given more than the city had any right to ask, but when she asked, casting her eyes toward the kids as if they were ravenous ears, whether men with grievances ever hired men with matches, Ray's mouth twitched in a way that meant yes. David, for his part, sat down at the motel's flimsily draped desk and began assembling a dossier of the emails he had received, an archivist of his own threat, forwarding them to Ray, highlighting phrases that struck him as ritualistic rather than spontaneous. The repeated, Move impediments. The fixation on clearing what chokes growth, a metaphor that belonged to construction and gardens, and also to men who thought people were weeds. By late afternoon, he had linked one of the burner accounts to a username on a contractor forum that had argued obsessively about delay culture. And when he said the phrase aloud, Eliza shivered, because it was the kind of phrase that justifies cruelty in a suit and tie. Margaret would not call what she felt fear. She reserved that sacred word for the moment in the hallway when the smoke turned black and her body recognized death. This now was vigilance sharpened into a tool, and she put it to use the way she put everything to use. Practically. She returned to East Monroe Street to her lottery cart, because to abandon it would be to announce to the watching city that she could be moved like a pawn. She cleaned the glass, aligned the tickets, set out Rufus's water bowl, and greeted customers with a voice that carried both the steadiness of yesterday and the weight of last night's new gravity. And it was not 10 minutes before the first curious soul leaned on the cart's edge to say they'd seen her on a neighbour's video, that she had done a brave thing, that the dog looked like he deserved a steak bigger than his head. And Margaret smiled and deflected, and then listened, because people who come to buy luck often spill information they don't know is precious. A drywall installer with paint on his knuckles mentioned that his boss had been approached off books to accelerate a schedule on the west lot. A bus driver said he'd seen a white van idling near the Carter's Alley 3 times in the last week with the same driver, a man who wore a cap even in heat. A teenage girl with a talent for noticing the shoes men wear said the watcher in the hedge had old, expensive boots, not the kind a day labourer buys. More like a foreman or a man who wants to be mistaken for one. Margaret passed these fragments to Ray via text like a contraband trade, and his responses came. Quick and spare. Thank you. Keep observations general in public. Do not engage. I'll send someone to sit eyes on your corner. And that someone turned out to be Officer Trin, plain-clothed in a sunshine yellow windbreaker that was either camouflage or bait depending on the angle, who bought a scratcher with a grin and stood at the bus stop long enough to evaluate every man who got off. By twilight, the pressure that had redistributed began to focus into a point, as pressure does when men who confuse intimidation with strategy realize their first message didn't land. The Carter's motel phone rang with the front desk number spoofed, asking for a courtesy update on their extended stay billing. And when Eliza answered with the name Ray had taught her, "We'll discuss with Investigator Molina," the line died with a beep-beep that sounded like petty fury. Margaret's cart received a customer who tried too hard to look casual, bought a ticket with a 20, declined change, and left the bill with the faintest smear of a mechanic's hand and a dot of green paint that matched a developer's fence downtown. Rufus, who had slept most of the afternoon, rose suddenly and planted himself between Margaret and the curb. His tail low, his ears pricked at a sedan that rolled by twice in 5 minutes with a driver who stared openly and then pretended to be searching for an address. Margaret did something then that the Margaret of a week ago would not have done. She wrote the plate number on her palm, in ballpoint snagged from the cart, called Ray, and then called David. And the act of linking those 2 men, one who bore authority, one who bore responsibility, felt like building a small bridge over a creek that, if ignored, turns canyon. The confrontation, when it came, wore the clothes of coincidence and the smell of old gasoline. Margaret closed the cart at 9, Rufus moving stiffly, the day's conversations rustling like papers in her head. And as she turned down the side street that cut toward the motel, a street with a mural of migrating geese that had peeled into a different flock long ago, a white work van oozed out of an alley and stopped just a fraction too far into the crosswalk, so she had to pause. The driver, a thick-necked man in his late 30s with sandy stubble and the indent of a ring on his finger. But no ring, smiled without warmth, a face built for ignoring rules, and said through a rolled-down window that he'd seen her on the news, that she was brave, that the world needed more citizens who understood the bigger picture, and the bigger picture in his mouth tasted like rot. Margaret nodded once and stepped to cross, and he inched the van forward with a comic mini-lurch, the kind boys used to do with bicycles to scare one another. And Rufus growled, a low, prehistoric sound that made the man's smirk falter, and he said, "Careful who you play hero for, lady." Some folks choke growth for a living, and then he drove off too fast, the tailpipe coughing a gout of smoke that smelled not like cheap oil, but like a warning. Margaret's hand shook for 3 steps, and then steadied because shaking is a luxury you get only in rooms with locks, and she reached the motel with a "How was your walk?" smile for the children and a set of sentences for Ray that began with the plate and ended with the phrase "ring tan," which he appreciated like proof. Ray moved from cautious to aggressive without changing his tone. He pulled traffic cams, caught the van twice near the Carter's Alley over 3 days, and put a detective named Andre Klein, early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, dark skin, a precise goatee, a habit of leaning his head as if listening to a whisper only he could hear, on the contractor with the temper and his knot ring. Andre spent a patient morning seated on a bucket outside a coffee truck 2 blocks from a job site, wearing neon vest theater and sipping something that was more patience than caffeine. And because men who believe themselves invisible talk in a register audible to anyone who cares to listen, he collected a brag about a clean message, a complaint about the old lady and her dog, and the phrase padlocked neat as a sermon, which made his pen pause for the same fraction Margaret's had when she saw the hedge watcher. Warrants are slow until they are not. By evening, Ray had a judge's ink on 2, and the search of the contractor's warehouse space turned up a bottle of brand-name accelerant primer with a lot code Ray had already seen ghosted into residue on the Carter laundry floor, plus a roll of low-residence duct tape with teeth marks at the end like an impatient man's signature. No single item was a verdict. Together, they were a paragraph, and Ray liked paragraphs. Yet shadows do not accept arrest politely, they leak around it, and as the police machine turned its gears, a new pressure built in a different corner. The developers LLC issued a statement about delays caused by unfortunate incidents. A civic group filed an emergency injunction claiming the fire proved the neighborhood's infrastructure stress. And a talk radio host with a bully's laugh threaded the phrases into a narrative that turned the Carters into symbols, which is to say, targets. That night, returning from a second loop with Rufus because movement was the only way to sand her edges, Margaret found a paper under her motel door. No envelope, no signature, bearing 4 words in block letters. Go back to selling. And beneath it, a cartoon of a dog with X's for eyes, not even well drawn, which somehow made it crueler. And when she showed it to Ray, he did not say, "Ignore it." He said, "Thank you." Because to call something what it is strips it of stage lighting. Eliza's hands trembled when she saw, then stilled, because she had decided last night that her trembling would belong to private time only. David wanted to storm downstairs and demand cameras be rewound to the minute, but Andre had already asked, and the footage showed only a hoodie and a gloved hand sliding the paper like a hotel menu. Perfunctory, efficient, cowardly. It was Margaret, paradoxically, who found sleep first that night, head tipped back in the motel chair, Rufus's breath thick against her ankle. And in the watery dream that followed, she was back at her cart on East Monroe, making change, the sky rinse blue. Nothing bad yet. And her late husband stood across the street in his coveralls, wiping his hands on a rag, smiling the lopsided smile men wear when they love you. And the world has not yet explained what it plans. And he lifted 2 fingers in a salute that meant, "Keep going, kid. You're doing fine." And when she woke, there was a weight in her chest that hurt less than grief and more than memory. And she whispered, "Okay," into the half-dark, which is a contract if you say it like you mean it. Morning came armed with the final confirmation. Lab results on the residue. Petroleum distillate consistent with a commercial primer. Tool marks on the back window. Flathead pried from left at an angle that matched the contractor's pry bar. And, from Andre's quiet rustling in a man's trash, a crumpled printout of the Carter's address with impediment written in all caps beside it and a second address circled right below. The street where Margaret's apartment sat over the laundromat. When Ray laid the paper on the motel desk, The room went still in that way that happens before storms. Eliza's hand found Margaret's without searching. David swore softly and with exactness. Ben pressed Roxy to his chest so hard the cat protested, and then went quiet, as if she too had learned sudden solemnity. And Rufus, creaky and royal, raised his head and thumped his tail once, as if to say the word all soldiers understand. Ready. By the time the case had grown too big for whispers, the whole town seemed to breathe in the rhythm of the fire. Each conversation on East Monroe Street beginning with lowered voices and ending with furtive glances at the blackened skeleton of the Carter home. And Margaret Whitfield felt the weight of eyes on her whenever she unfolded her lottery cart. Eyes that said she was no longer invisible, that the woman who sold dollar tickets and spoke kindly to the weary had become a character in a story the city could not stop telling. And though she had not asked for it, she carried it with the same steadiness she had carried everything in her life. Her auburn grey hair tied back, her faded denim jacket hiding the bruises from the night she had braced herself against a window frame to push Rufus through, her hazel eyes sharp with a clarity that made people pause before speaking. Rufus himself, though slowed again after his bursts of heroism, remained at her side, muzzle frosted white, golden brown fur thinned, his breathing louder than before, yet full of the same watchfulness, his loyalty as stubborn as ever. And in his gaze, Margaret found the courage to keep showing up when fear whispered she should stay home. The Carters, meanwhile, were learning what it meant to be survivors of a crime that had made them symbols, living first in the motel under constant patrol, then in a borrowed duplex arranged by friends, where David, his clean-shaven jaw set like stone, spent evenings compiling documents and emails, patterns of threats and names, the dossier of a man who understood that fighting shadows required light, while Eliza, petite frame drawn tighter by stress, but steadied by love, held the children close and insisted that routine, cereal, bedtime stories, coloring books, was a kind of defiance. Detective Andre Klein had followed the evidence trail from the reckless contractor with his ringless tan finger and temper to the developer's shell company, the LLC, that grinned from behind a veil of lawyers, and he moved with patient precision, leaning his tall, broad frame over conference tables where men tried to bluff, listening with that tilted head of his as if the truth were a sound beneath their lies. And each time he returned to Ray Molina with another thread, an invoice marked consulting but paid in cash, a permit application that referenced parcels untouched, a burner phone linked to both the contractor and the van. Ray's salt and pepper mustache twitched with grim satisfaction, the satisfaction of a veteran who knows the fire had never been the point, but only the tool. When at last they confronted the contractor with the evidence, he cracked not with guilt, but with pride, boasting that he had been hired to clear impediments, that the padlocked door had been a clean message, and that his only mistake had been underestimating an old woman and her dog, words that Margaret would hear later in court and carry like a badge she had never sought. But it was not enough to cage one reckless man. The true architects remained in offices with polished wood and bottled water, men who had calculated that fear could buy them land faster than money. And when the investigation pressed upward, subpoenas dragging paper into daylight, the truth revealed itself with the inevitability of dawn. A development scheme to clear families from properties that stood in the way, threats escalating into arson, contractors used as muscle, all tied by signatures and bank transfers, and when the arrests came, the headlines named not just the arsonist, but the men in suits who had thought themselves untouchable. The Carters stood in the courtroom, their children too young to understand the full weight, while Margaret sat quietly in the back, Rufus lying at her feet, his breathing heavy but steady. And when the verdict was read, she felt a loosening inside, a knot untied, not just for the Carters, but for herself, for all the years she had thought her life too small to matter. She walked out into sunlight, her denim jacket smelling faintly of smoke even now, and thought of her husband, of the long years alone, and of how Rufus had carried her through each of them until this moment, and when a reporter thrust a microphone toward her and asked if she considered herself a hero, She shook her head and said simply, "I did what anyone should when someone's in trouble. And my dog, he did more than I did." And Rufus, as if understanding, thumped his tail once, the sound a punctuation mark on a story that belonged as much to him as to anyone. Life did not return to normal, not really, because normal had been burned away with the Carter house. But a new rhythm emerged. The Carters began to rebuild on the same lot, the frame of a new home rising like defiance against the blackened ground. David took a new position with a firm that promised transparency. His square jaw finally relaxed enough to smile. Eliza planted basil in the new windowsill, her pale face softening when the children laughed. Ben kept the tabby Roxy as his personal shadow, and Lily, quiet and observant, began drawing pictures of houses with flowers out front, and a woman with grey-streaked hair and a dog beside her, which she gave to Margaret as gifts. And Margaret herself returned to her cart, selling tickets on East Monroe. But people now stopped longer, speaking to her with a respect that surprised her, telling her their own fears and hopes as though courage were contagious. She listened, sold the tickets, patted Rufus when he dozed at her feet, and in the quiet moments she thought of how fate had chosen her corner, her dog, her heart, to tip the balance for one family and to expose a truth meant to stay hidden. She never grew used to the word hero, but she grew used to the way people's eyes softened when they looked at her, the way strangers scratched Rufus under his white muzzle as though he were a monument, and she allowed herself, at last, to feel less alone. When summer came and the Carters invited her to the first barbecue in their rebuilt yard, Margaret stood with a paper plate of potato salad, watching children run, hearing laughter rise. Rufus stretched out on the grass beside Ben, the boy's hand tangled in his fur, and she thought, with a warmth she had not felt in years, that maybe her life had never been as small as she believed. The fire had been set with cruelty, but out of its smoke had come connection, resilience, and a reminder that even the most ordinary lives can blaze when called upon. And as the evening deepened and the fireflies blinked, Margaret whispered to Rufus, "We did all right, didn't we, boy?" And the old dog lifted his head, eyes clouded but bright, and gave a single wag of his tail that said more than words ever could.